She was a ghost, an interpreter paid to be invisible in rooms filled with monsters. But a single phone call, a few whispered words in a forgotten, ancient language, made her the obsession of the most dangerous man in Italy. And hours later, when another man dared to touch her, he made a declaration that sealed her fate forever, and began a story you will not believe. The air in the room was worth more than her entire life. Isabella Rossi knew that with a certainty that settled like ice in her stomach. It wasn't just the hotel, a palace of marble and gold overlooking the heart of Milan, or the suits on the men around the long mahogany table, each one costing more than her yearly rent. It was the atmosphere itself, thick, heavy, woven with the scent of expensive leather, aged whiskey, and the metallic tang of unspoken power. She was a ghost here, a necessary tool. Her job was to be invisible, a seamless bridge between languages. Her voice a sterile conduit for billion-euro deals. And invisibility was her sanctuary. She stood just behind the shoulder of a German executive, her posture perfect, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality. She translated his words about logistics and shipping ports into flawless corporate Italian, keeping her tone even, betraying none of the man's underlying greed. Her mind was a fortress, deflecting the little details that threatened to make this world too real. The glint of a diamond cufflink here, the casual cruelty in a comment there. She was a performer, and this was her most dangerous stage. But her eyes, against her will, kept drifting to the man at the head of the table. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the most animated. In fact, he had barely spoken a word for the last hour. Yet, the entire room orbited him. He was a point of gravity, pulling all light and sound and attention into the quiet stillness of his presence. Luca Moretti. The name was a whisper in the city, a legend spoken in hushed tones. They said he owned half of Milan's shipping, and the other half was afraid of him. He looked less like a businessman and more like a fallen angel from a Renaissance painting, all harsh planes and shadowed intensity. His black suit was tailored to perfection over a frame that spoke of disciplined strength. His dark hair was swept back, and his eyes were the most terrifying part. They were a deep, starless black, and they missed nothing. Isabella had felt his gaze on her twice. It wasn't a casual glance. It wasn't the lecherous once-over she was used to from men of this caliber. It was different. It was analytical, like a predator assessing an unfamiliar creature in its territory, trying to decide if it was prey, a threat, or something else entirely. Each time his eyes met hers, a cold shock went through her, a primal instinct to run, to disappear. She would quickly look down at her notepad, her heart hammering against her ribs, her professionalism the only shield she had. He made her feel seen, and being seen was the one thing she could not afford. Being seen was death. She took a steadying breath, focusing on the drone of the German's voice. Just a few more hours, she told herself. A few more hours, and she could escape back to her tiny, safe apartment, to the simple, anonymous life she had fought so hard to build. A life where names like Moretti were just boogeymen from a past she had buried. Then it happened. A betrayal from her own pocket. Her phone vibrated. It was a soft, barely perceptible buzz against her hip, but in the hyper-aware tension of the room, it felt like a gunshot. Her blood ran cold. No one was supposed to call her during a job. No one. She had made that rule absolute. It could only be one person. Nonna. Panic, sharp and blinding, sliced through her composure. Something was wrong. Her grandmother never called unless it was an emergency. Was she hurt? Did she fall? 100 terrible scenarios flooded her mind. The German executive paused, waiting for her translation. Every eye at the table turned to her. The silence was absolute, accusatory. And worst of all, Luca Moretti's head lifted, his dark gaze pinning her in place. Her training, her years of careful control, evaporated. There was no German executive, no billion-euro deal, only the raw, filial fear for the only family she had left. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, she pulled the phone from her pocket, her hands trembling as she accepted the call. She turned slightly, trying to shield the act, a pathetic attempt at discretion. She brought the phone to her ear. "Nonna?" she whispered, the name a prayer. Her grandmother's voice came through, frail but frantic, speaking in the old tongue, the dialect of their village, a language of soft vowels and lyrical cadences that was as much a part of her soul as her own heartbeat. It was the language of lullabies and secret stories, a language that had no place here. And Isabella, lost in the icy grip of her fear, answered back in the same tongue. "Sto bene, nonna. Che è successo? Parla piano." "I'm fine, nonna. What happened?" "Speak slowly." Her words were soft, a gentle murmur meant only for the old woman on the other end of the line, but they floated into the silent room like feathers in a hurricane. They were meaningless to the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, but not to him, not to Luca Moretti. She saw it. She felt it, the shift in his entire being. It was as if she had struck a match in a room full of gasoline. His stillness shattered. He didn't move a muscle, but the lazy disinterest in his eyes was gone, replaced by an electrifying, razor-sharp focus. His gaze locked onto hers, and this time there was no analysis. There was only shock, and a terrifying, consuming intrigue. The air crackled. The world narrowed to the space between them. It was a stare that stripped her bare, that saw past the professional interpreter, past the anonymous girl, and straight into the heart of the secret she had guarded with her life. In that moment, Isabella Rossi knew her invisibility was gone. She had just stepped out of the shadows and into the personal, undivided attention of the most dangerous man in Italy.
Boredom was a physical weight on Luca Moretti's shoulders. He sat at the head of the table, a king presiding over a court of fools. These men, with their expensive watches and their easy smiles, thought power was about numbers on a spreadsheet. They preened and postured, their words slick with flattery, their eyes darting towards him, seeking approval like hungry dogs. They were insects, predictable, weak. He could crush any one of them without a second thought, and the world would keep spinning. This was his life, an endless parade of tedious meetings, of filtering lies from half-truths, of maintaining an empire built on the bones of men far stronger than these pathetic creatures. He sipped his water, the crystal cool against his lips. His consigliere, Marco, stood behind him, a silent statue, his presence a familiar comfort. Marco could handle the details. Luca was here for the performance, to be the shadow that gave the Moretti name its weight. His gaze swept the room, cataloging, dismissing. The German was pompous, the American, a snake. The Japanese investors were shrewd, the only ones worth a fraction of his time. And then there was the interpreter. He'd noticed her when she first walked in. It was impossible not to. In a room full of peacocks, she was a sparrow, plainly dressed in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She radiated an aura of quiet competence that was at odds with the nervous energy humming around her. But it was more than that. There was a tension in the way she held herself, a rigidity in her spine that spoke of immense control. She was beautiful, yes, in a subtle, classical way, with high cheekbones and wide, intelligent eyes. But her beauty was a footnote. What intrigued him was the feeling that she was wearing a costume, that the bland interpreter was a carefully constructed fiction. He'd watched her all night, a welcome distraction from the mind-numbing drivel of international finance. He saw the way she never quite met anyone's eyes, the way her fingers, though steady, were held tightly at her sides. She was hiding. And Luca had an insatiable curiosity for things that were hidden. He had caught her eye twice. The first time, he saw a flicker of something raw and untamed behind her professional mask before she looked away. The second time, he saw fear, pure, undiluted fear. It was the fear of a forest creature suddenly finding itself face to face with a wolf. It amused him. What could a simple translator possibly have to fear from him? Unless, of course, she wasn't so simple. He was about to tune out completely, to let his mind drift to more pressing matters, like the growing insolence of Silvio Ricci, the pig sitting 3 seats to his left, when a vibration disturbed the room's stale air. It came from her, the interpreter. Her entire body went rigid. He watched, his interest peaked, as panic flashed across her features, a genuine emotion that was far more interesting than the feigned cordiality at this table. She pulled out her phone. A rookie mistake. A sign of unprofessionalism he would normally dismiss with contempt. But then she spoke into it. Just one word. A name. Nonna? And then another language. It wasn't the crisp, modern Italian she used for her work. No, this was something else entirely. It was a dialect so old he had not heard it spoken aloud since his grandfather died. It was the language of the earth, of the mountains, of families whose roots went so deep they were entangled with the very bedrock of the country, a language of blood oaths and ancient loyalties. It was the tongue of the old guard, the founding famigli, and as her soft melodic words reached his ears, Luca felt a jolt, as if lightning had struck the base of his spine. The boredom, the apathy, the crushing weight of his life, it all vanished. In its place, a singular white-hot thought burned through his mind. Rossi. The dialect was unmistakable. It belonged to only one family, a family that had vanished from the world 2 decades ago, a family that was supposed to be extinct, wiped out, a ghost. He lifted his head, and his gaze slammed into hers. The fear was still in her eyes, but now he understood it. It wasn't the fear of a powerful man. It was the fear of being found. The mask was gone. In its place was the terrified face of a girl with a secret big enough to get her killed. The sparrow was no sparrow at all. She was something far rarer, something thought to be lost forever. The men at the table faded into irrelevant noise. The multi-billion euro deal was forgotten. Silvio Ricci's sneering face disappeared from his periphery. His entire world, which moments before had felt vast and empty, had now shrunk to the 6 feet of space between him and this woman. Who was she? How was she here? What did she want? 1,000 questions exploded in his mind, but one truth rose above them all with chilling clarity. He had just found something, someone, infinitely more valuable than any shipping port or corporate merger. He had found a living piece of history, a key to a past he thought was buried forever, and he would not be letting her go.
Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Isabella felt the fragile glass of her life crack. Luca Moretti's eyes were not just looking at her. They were dissecting her, peeling back 20 years of carefully constructed lies with a single, searing gaze. Her Nonna's frantic voice was still a faint buzz in her ear, something about a broken pipe and a flooded kitchen, a mundane disaster that had just triggered an existential one. She mumbled a few soothing words in their shared dialect, her voice trembling, and ended the call. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, colder, and shaped entirely like him. Her mind screamed a single word: run. It was a lesson her father had tried to teach her before he died. He'd sit with her in their small garden, his hands smelling of earth and motor oil, his face etched with a permanent worry. Isabella, he'd say, his voice low. Our name, Rossi, it's like a beautiful, heavy stone. You can't carry it in this new world. You must put it down. Let it sink to the bottom of the river and walk away without looking back. You must be nobody, tesoro mio. Nobody is safe. She hadn't understood then. She was just a little girl who loved the stories of brave Rossi men and clever Rossi women. She didn't understand that those stories were ghosts, each one hungry to drag them back into the grave. She understood now. Looking into Luca Moretti's eyes, she felt the weight of that stone, chained to her ankle, ready to pull her down into the dark. Her father had tried to sever the chain, to buy their freedom from the world of men like Moretti. All it bought him was a car that went off a mountain road and a funeral attended by weeping women in black. He had tried to run, and he had died. Her life since had been an exercise in honoring his sacrifice, a new city, A new name. Rossi was common enough to hide in plain sight if you were quiet enough. A profession that put her in rooms like this, but allowed her to be utterly forgettable. Until now. The German executive cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Is everything all right, Ms. Rossi?" Isabella's composure snapped back into place like a soldier saluting. It was a reflex honed by years of practice. She gave a small, apologetic smile that felt like cracking porcelain. "My apologies, gentlemen, a small family matter. It is resolved." She turned back to the German, ready to translate, her mind a whirlwind of terror. She had to finish the job. She had to walk out of this hotel, get in a taxi, and disappear. Maybe for good this time. A new city, a new country. Could she get to Nona in time? Could they run together? The rest of the dinner was a blur. She functioned on autopilot, her translations flawless, her voice a calm, even monotone. But her entire being was screaming. She didn't dare look at the head of the table again, but she felt his eyes on her. It was a physical pressure, a heat against her skin. He knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. He had heard the ghost of her past in her voice, and she knew, with a certainty that made her sick, that he was not the kind of man who let ghosts rest. Her deepest desire was so simple it was almost painful. A quiet life. A cup of tea in the morning, the smell of rain on the pavement, the safety of being anonymous. And her deepest fear was sitting 20 feet away, watching her, a patient predator who had all the time in the world.
Luca watched her recover. It was magnificent. The panic in her eyes was shuttered away, the mask of the polite interpreter sliding back into place as if it had never left. She was good. Years of practice there. Years of hiding. It only made him more certain. The name echoed in his mind, a half-forgotten piece of a story his grandfather used to tell him. Rossi. They were not deal-makers or thugs. They were keepers of the old ways, known for their unbreakable honor and their fierce loyalty. They were thought to be a dead branch on the family tree of their world, pruned 2 decades ago. His grandfather had spoken of them with a grudging respect. "A Rossi's word is worth more than gold, Luca," he'd said, his voice raspy with age and cigar smoke. Their mistake was believing everyone else's was too. Luca felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion stir in his chest. It was a flicker of something almost like hope. He was so tired, so profoundly weary of the backstabbing, the deceit, the so-called businessmen at his table like Silvio Ricci, a man whose ambition was as cheap and vulgar as the oversized ring on his pinky finger. Ricci was a cancer, a symptom of the disease that had infected their world, turning honor into a commodity and loyalty into a negotiation. Luca ruled this world, but he despised its modern form. He craved the weight, the certainty, the meaning of the old ways. And this woman, this ghost in a black dress, had spoken its language. The dinner finally ended. Chairs scraped against the marble floor. The men stood shaking hands, their fake laughter echoing in the cavernous room. Luca remained seated watching her. He saw her subtle movements, the way she packed her satchel with an efficiency that screamed of a desire to flee. She was planning to bolt. He almost smiled. Silvio Ricci swaggered over to him, a foul cloud of cologne announcing his arrival. "A good night, Don Moretti. Very profitable." Luca didn't look at him. His eyes were still on her as she made her way towards the exit. "Was it, Silvio?" Ricci's greasy smile faltered for a second. "Of course. And the entertainment, that little interpreter, she has fire. Perhaps a bit unprofessional. Taking calls, but..." Luca's gaze finally shifted, moving from Isabella to Ricci. He let the full, cold weight of his attention fall on the other man. "She is not entertainment." The words were quiet, deadly. Ricci paled, the bravado draining from his face. "No, of course not. I only meant..." "I know what you meant." Luca cut him off. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod over his shoulder. Marco, who had been a silent presence all night, stepped forward. Marco was Luca's shadow, his oldest friend, the only man he trusted without reservation. He was shorter than Luca, solidly built, with a calm, unassuming face that hid a mind like a steel trap. "Marco," Luca said, his voice low. "The Rossi matter. Handle it." Marco's eyes flickered towards Isabella's retreating back, then back to Luca. No more words were needed. He understood perfectly. He nodded once. "Yes, Don Moretti." Luca watched Marco move away, not towards Isabella, but on a path to intercept her. His focus then returned to the trembling man in front of him. He gave Ricci a smile that held no warmth, only the chilling promise of a frozen grave. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Silvio. Be careful on your way home." It was a dismissal and a threat, perfectly wrapped in civility. Ricci practically stumbled over himself to get away. Finally alone, Luca leaned back in his chair, a real, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time all night. He felt a thrill he hadn't felt in years. The game had changed. A ghost had walked into his life, and he, Luca Moretti, was going to find out why. He wasn't just the Don of the Moretti family. He was a guardian of its history. And the Rossis? The Rossis were a chapter he was beginning to suspect had been deliberately torn from the books. He had to know the truth. And he had to have her. Not just for the secrets she held, but for the fire he'd seen in her eyes, the echo of that lost, honorable world he so desperately craved.
Freedom was 20 yards away. The ornate double doors of the private dining room were open, leading to the grand hotel lobby, which in turn led to the street, the city, the rest of the world. Isabella's feet moved quickly, her sensible heels making soft, urgent clicks on the polished marble. She didn't look back. Looking back was a fatal mistake. Her bag was clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. The plan was simple. Don't stop, don't talk to anyone, melt into the crowds. She could do this. She had been doing it her whole life. She was almost there. 10 more feet. The sounds of the lobby, the gentle melody of a piano, the murmur of guests, were a siren song of escape. "Ms. Rossi." The voice was calm, polite, and it stopped her dead in her tracks more effectively than a physical barrier. It wasn't Luca Moretti. She turned slowly, her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. A man stood before her. He was of average height, dressed in a simple dark suit with a plain, forgettable face. He looked like an accountant or a mid-level manager, but his eyes were not plain. They were intelligent, watchful, and held an unnerving stillness. She recognized him instantly. He had been standing behind Moretti's chair all night. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of detached professionalism. "My name is Marco," he said, his tone just as professional. "I am Mr. Moretti's assistant. He was very impressed with your work this evening." It was a lie, and they both knew it. This wasn't about her work. "Thank you. If you'll excuse me, I have another engagement." She tried to step around him. He didn't move. He simply stood there, a pleasant, immovable object. Mr. Moretti was concerned. "The phone call seemed to upset you. He insisted that we see you home safely. A car is waiting. A car is waiting." The words, meant to sound like a courtesy, felt like the closing of a cage door. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, washed over her. This was it. This was how it happened. Not with a bang, but with a polite offer you couldn't refuse. "That's very kind, but entirely unnecessary. I'm perfectly capable of getting a taxi." "He insists," Marco said. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes conveyed a simple, unassailable fact. This was not a request. "Please, we wouldn't want to create a scene." And there it was. The velvet glove removed to show the iron fist. She looked past him, through the doors into the lobby. She saw the anonymous faces, the happy couples, the tourists. They were living in a different world, one where a man offering a woman a ride home was just a kind gesture. Her world had just shrunk to the size of this hallway, with this polite, implacable man as its warden. She thought of her father, of his warnings, of the heavy stone of her name. She had tried to let it go, but it had just been lying in wait at the bottom of the river, and Luca Moretti had just pulled it from the water. Defeated, she gave a stiff nod. There was no choice. To fight here would be to lose spectacularly. Her only hope was to play along, to watch, to wait for an opening. "Very well," she said, the words tasting like ash. "If he insists." Marco's smile became genuine. "Excellent," he said, gesturing for her to precede him. "This way." As she walked past him, a prisoner being escorted to her doom, Isabella Rossi knew her life as a nobody was officially over. She had become somebody who belonged to Luca Moretti. The walk from the dining room to the car was the longest of Isabella's life. Every step was a surrender. The hotel lobby, which had seemed a beacon of hope moments before, was now just a pretty backdrop for her abduction. People laughed and chatted, glasses clinked at the bar, and no one saw the invisible cage descending around her. She was a ghost again, but a different kind. She was the kind no one saw being taken. Marco walked beside her, his presence a silent, unyielding pressure. He didn't touch her, but she felt his control in the space between them. The car was a black sedan, sleek and anonymous, parked in a private underground garage. The driver was a mountain of a man who didn't even glance at her as she slid into the back. The door closed with a heavy, final thud. It sounded like a vault ceiling. Marco got in the other side, and the car pulled out into the glittering Milan night. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of her chest, but she couldn't afford to let it out. Not now. She forced it down, replaced it with a cold, sharp focus. She watched the streets go by, the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood getting farther and farther away. They weren't taking her home. Of course they weren't. What a fool she'd been to even entertain the thought. Every turn the car made was a turn deeper into a life she had never wanted. She had to make a decision. She could scream, fight, try to break a window. That would end quickly and badly. Or she could do what she did best: observe, adapt, and wait. She had survived for 20 years by being quiet and intelligent. She would not abandon that strategy now. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her dress and adopted an air of weary confusion. It was a role. Everything in her life was a role. Today, she was the damsel, slightly distressed, but compliant. It was the least threatening she could be. "Marco, was it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Could you please tell me where we're going? I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Marco turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Mr. Moretti just wishes to speak with you privately, to clear the air." "About what?" she pressed, playing her part. "My phone call? It was unprofessional, I know, and I apologize. It was a family emergency, but a minor one. I can assure you—" "He will explain everything," Marco said, his calm tone ending the conversation. The car didn't drive to a warehouse or a dark alley. It circled back, pulling into a discreet, private entrance of the very same hotel, the Hotel Principe. Of course. He owned it, she remembered hearing. He owned everything. The sense of being trapped intensified. She wasn't just in his car. She was in his city, his hotel, his world. They rode a private elevator, its walls mirrored, forcing her to look at her own reflection. A pale, wide-eyed woman whose life was spiraling out of control. The elevator opened directly into a suite, a penthouse. The room was breathtaking, a sprawling space of dark wood, minimalist furniture, and a wall of glass that looked out over the entire city of Milan, a carpet of glittering lights. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying cage she had ever seen. And there he was. Luca Moretti stood by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. A tattoo of a serpent coiled around one wrist. He looked less like a CEO and more like a king in his throne room. He turned as they entered, and his dark eyes found hers immediately. "Thank you, Marco," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can wait outside." Marco nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. Isabella was alone with him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. She stood frozen just inside the door, her bag clutched in her hand like a shield. "Please," he said, gesturing to a plush sofa. "Make yourself comfortable. A drink?" "No, thank you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Moretti, I think—" "Luca," he corrected her, taking a step closer. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly predatory. "My name is Luca." He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne and the sharp tang of the whiskey in his glass. "And I think we have a great deal to discuss." Her heart hammered. This was it, the interrogation. She had to hold her nerve. "With all due respect, Luca, I'm just an interpreter. We have nothing to discuss. If you'll allow me to leave, I won't breathe a word of this to anyone." He smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips. "Oh, I know you won't. But you're wrong. You are not just an interpreter. You are a historian of a sort. And you spoke a language tonight I thought was dead." He took another step, his eyes boring into hers. The pretense was over. "So, I will ask you a question. And I want you to think very carefully before you answer. How does a girl from nowhere speak the language of the lost Rossi family?"
He watched her on the security feed as Marco brought her up. She walked with her head held high, her fear locked down tight behind a mask of poise. He was impressed, deeply. Most people, men and women alike, crumbled in the face of his power. They wept, or begged, or blustered. She did none of those things. She simply observed, her intelligent eyes taking everything in. She was a survivor. It was etched into her very soul. When she stepped into his suite, he felt that same jolt he'd felt at the dinner table. It was more than just attraction. It was a feeling of recognition, as if a piece of his own history, a part of his own soul he didn't even know was missing, had just walked into the room. She looked so small and out of place in the vastness of the penthouse, and yet she had an energy, a resilience, that filled the space. He wanted to crack it open, to see what was inside, to understand the fire that he knew burned beneath that icy control. He offered her a drink, a simple gesture of hospitality that was also a test. She refused. Of course she did. She wouldn't accept anything from him, wouldn't give him even that small measure of control. He admired her for it. He moved closer, wanting to see her reaction, to gauge her fear. It was there, in the slight tremor of her hands, the rapid pulse he could see beating in the delicate skin of her throat. But her eyes held his. Defiant. Proud. God, she was magnificent. He decided to dispense with the games. There was no point in circling the issue. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. He posed the question, dropping the name like a stone into a silent pool. How does a girl from nowhere speak the language of the lost Rossi family? He watched the impact of his words. Her composure finally, truly broke. The color drained from her face. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, he saw not just fear but utter soul-deep terror. It was the look of a ghost that has just been seen for the first time. The confirmation was so absolute it was like a signed confession. She was one of them. She was a Rossi. Here, in his city, in his hotel, in his room. It was impossible. It was a miracle. And it was a problem. A beautiful, dangerous problem he now owned. Before he could press her, before she could even form a denial, a sharp knock came at the suite door. Luca's head snapped up, irritation flaring. He had given strict orders not to be disturbed. Marco opened the door a crack, his body blocking the entrance. "Don Moretti, my apologies," It is Silvio Ricci. He is insistent. Luca's jaw tightened. Ricci, of all the pathetic dogs to come sniffing at his door. Get rid of him. I've tried, Marco said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel. He is drunk. He's making a scene. And as if on cue, the door was shoved open. Silvio Ricci stumbled in, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance. Two of Luca's guards stood behind him, looking apologetic, but unable to restrain the rival boss without starting a war. Ricci's eyes, slick and greedy, scanned the room and then landed on Isabella. A disgusting, triumphant sneer spread across his face. So, this is the private meeting. I knew it. Knew she was more than just some translator. He started towards Isabella, his movements unsteady. What's the secret, little bird? Did the Morettis find a new whore to sing for them? Luca's blood turned to ice. A low growl rumbled in his chest. This pig, this dishonorable piece of trash, was daring to speak to her like that. In his home. Isabella flinched back as Ricci reached for her, his beefy hand outstretched to grab her arm. Come on. Ricci slurred, his eyes filled with a brutish possessiveness. Let's find out who you really are. I'm sure you have plenty of secrets to share. He was inches from her. The terror on her face was stark, real. And in that instant, something shifted in Luca. It was no longer about history or secrets or legacies. It was simpler, more primal. Ricci was reaching for something that belonged to him. Luca's voice sliced through the tension, not loud, but carrying the lethal chill of absolute authority. It stopped Ricci's hand mid-air. It stopped the breathing of every man in the room. No one touches her. The words hung in the air, an unbreakable decree. It was a warning. It was a promise. It was a public declaration to the entire world. This woman, this ghost with the face of an angel and the name of a fallen family, was his. And heaven help anyone who tried to challenge that claim.
The four words echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of the room. No one touches her. It was not a request. It was a commandment, spoken by a man who was a god in his own universe. Silvio Ricci's hand, which had been reaching for her, froze in mid-air. The drunken bravado in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the stark, sober terror of a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He retracted his hand as if her skin were made of acid. Isabella felt a dizzying wave of something. It wasn't relief. Relief was a gentle, warming thing. This was a cold shock, a plunge into an even deeper, more dangerous part of the river. One moment, she was prey for a common thug. The next, she was the declared property of a king. She wasn't sure which was worse. Being claimed was not the same as being saved. It was just a change of ownership. Luca Moretti didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself between her and Ricci. The sheer force of his presence was a physical shield. "Get out of my home, Silvio," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. Ricci stumbled backward, his face a mask of sweat and fear. "Luca, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was drunk." "You are a disgrace to your family's name," Luca said, his tone cutting like glass. "Now you are a disgrace in my home. Leave, before I forget the courtesy my father once showed yours." Ricci didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran from the room, his guards scrambling after him. Marco closed the door behind them, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Isabella was alone with Luca again, but the air had changed. The invisible lines of power had been drawn, and she was standing squarely on his side of them, whether she wanted to be or not. She finally found her voice, a thread of sound in the crushing quiet. "I am not yours to protect." Luca turned to her, and the cold fury in his eyes softened into something else, something she couldn't name. It was intense, possessive, and deeply curious. "After what just happened," he said, a humorless smile touching his lips, "you need my protection more than ever." Ricci is a dog, but he is a persistent one. Now that he knows you are important to me, he will not stop digging. You are safer here. The pieces clicked into place. The suite, the car, the polite abduction. It was all a cage, and the door had just been locked. Here? I can't stay here. My life, my grandmother. Your grandmother will be looked after, he said, the casual statement landing with the force of a physical blow. He knew about her Nona. Of course he did. He probably knew where she lived, what kind of tea she drank, everything. He was a man who dealt in information and control. I've already sent Marco to ensure her security. Rage, hot and sharp, pierced through her fear. Her security? You mean your control. You have no right. I have every right, he countered, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, magnetic. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to retreat. You walked into my world speaking a language of ghosts. You made yourself my business, Isabella Rossi. You will stay here as my guest until I have the answers I want. Your only decision is whether this will be pleasant or difficult. She stared at him, trapped. The city lights twinkled behind him, a mocking reminder of a world of freedom that was no longer hers. He was giving her a choice that was no choice at all. This was her new reality. A gilded cage at the top of Milan, with a beautiful, dangerous warden who looked at her like she was the most fascinating puzzle he'd ever seen. And the worst part? A treacherous, terrified part of her was captivated right back.
A grim, cold satisfaction settled in Luca's chest as he watched Ricci flee. The man was a disease, and tonight he'd been reminded of his place. But Luca knew it was a temporary victory. Ricci was a coward, but he was also like a rat, cunning and relentless when he scented weakness or opportunity. By claiming the girl, Luca had painted a target on her back. His declaration hadn't just been for Ricci. It was for his own men, for the whole city. It meant she was untouchable, but it also meant she was significant. The questions would start immediately. He dismissed the thoughts. He would deal with the consequences later. For now, he had the source of the mystery right in front of him. Her defiance, even now when she was so clearly outmatched, was intoxicating. The fire in her eyes when she challenged him. It had been years since anyone had dared to look at him that way. He felt a forgotten, thrilling part of himself stir to life. Your grandmother will be looked after, he told her, watching her face. The flash of fury was exactly what he expected. She was a fighter. Good. This would be much more interesting than if she had simply crumbled. He had already dispatched Marco with precise instructions. Find the grandmother, secure her home, but do it discreetly. The old woman was not to be harmed or frightened, but she was now a pawn on the board, a guarantee of Isabella's cooperation. It was a necessary move. He left her in the main living area of the suite, a vast space she seemed to shrink in, and went to his office. Marco was already there, waiting. Ricci is gone, Marco stated, his face impassive. He will be licking his wounds, but he will be back. He is too proud to let this go. Let him try, Luca said, pouring himself another whiskey. Double the security at his known businesses. I want to know every move he makes. And the grandmother? We have a location, a small apartment in the Navigli district. Quiet. She lives alone. I have 2 men watching the building from a parked car. Invisible. Good, Luca nodded. He trusted Marco's definition of invisible. What about the girl's background? What have you found? It's like she appeared out of thin air 10 years ago, Marco reported, consulting a tablet. Isabella Rossi, graduated top of her class in linguistics at the University of Milan. No family listed on her application except a grandmother, Elena Rossi. Before that, nothing. Her records are clean. Almost too clean. A ghost, just as you said. Someone cleaned them, Luca mused. Someone with skill. This only deepened the mystery. Her father had tried to leave the life, but he hadn't just run. He'd tried to erase them. Keep digging. I want to know everything. He went back out to the main room. Isabella stood by the window, a lonely silhouette against the city. He felt a strange pull, a desire to go to her, to offer. What? Comfort? That was absurd. He was her jailer. Still, he found himself walking over. He had ordered a late supper, and a cart with covered silver dishes had been placed by the sofa. "You should eat," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She didn't turn. "I'm not hungry." "That's a lie," he said simply. "You're trying to find some small way to defy me. A hunger strike. It's predictable, and it will only hurt you." He lifted the lid off one of the dishes. The rich aroma of saffron risotto filled the air. "Eat, Isabella. We have much to talk about, and you'll need your strength." She finally turned, her eyes flashing. "What is it you want from me? Money? My family has none. Revenge? We have done nothing to you." "I want the truth," he said, his voice low and intense. He sat on the sofa, a king holding court. "I want to know how the last of the Rossi family ends up working as a common interpreter, hiding in plain sight. For all I know, you were sent to me. A Rossi lamb sent to the Moretti wolf, seeking some kind of long-delayed justice." He leaned forward, his gaze hypnotic. "But your eyes, they are not the eyes of a lamb." She stared at him, her clever mind working. He could see her calculating, weighing her options. Finally, she walked over and sat in a chair opposite him, a chasm of expensive carpet between them. She picked up a fork. It was a surrender, but it was also a parley. She was agreeing to the game.
She ate. The risotto was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, and she hated him for it. She hated the way he watched her, not with lust, but with an unnerving, scholarly interest. She hated the way he made her feel like the most important person in the world while simultaneously reminding her that she was his prisoner. Every bite she took was a concession, an admission that he was right. She did need her strength. Their conversation was a duel. He would ask a question about her past, and she would deflect with a question of her own. "Why does the history of a lost family matter so much to a man like you?" she asked, her voice laced with a cool challenge. He considered her for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Because men like Silvio Ricci are what our world has become," he answered, his honesty surprising her. Greedy, honorless thugs with no respect for the past. The old families, the Rossis, the Morettis. We built this world on a code. That code is dying. Your family represented that code. Its disappearance was the beginning of the end. She was momentarily disarmed. He spoke of honor and codes, things she thought were fairy tales made up to justify violence. He was more complex than the simple monster she had imagined. He was a man burdened by a legacy he seemed to both cherish and despise. It made him more dangerous, because it made him almost human. But she couldn't forget her nonna. The next day, while Luca was occupied with meetings in his office, she saw her chance. A cleaner came to tidy the suite. While the woman was in the other room, Isabella saw a room service phone on the cart she'd left behind. Her heart pounded. It was a stupid risk, but she had to try. She had to warn her grandmother to run. She picked up the phone, her fingers fumbling as she tried to dial. Before she could press the last digit, a quiet voice spoke from behind her. "I would not do that, Ms. Rossi." She spun around. Marco stood in the doorway, his expression calm and slightly disappointed. He must have been watching her the whole time. He walked over and gently took the phone from her hand, placing it back on the receiver. "Don Moretti's protection is absolute," he said, his voice soft but firm. "In all ways. For your sake, please do not test its boundaries again." The calm, total control of it all was suffocating. She sank onto the sofa, defeated. There was no escape. Later that evening, Luca returned. She expected him to be angry about her failed escape attempt. She braced herself for threats or punishment, but his expression was unreadable. He was holding a small, old, black-and-white photograph, its edges worn with time. He walked over and placed it on the table in front of her. It was a picture of two young men, probably in their early 20s, standing with their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They were smiling, full of the easy confidence of youth. One of them, she recognized instantly, with a painful ache in her chest. It was her father. He looked so young, so carefree, a man she had barely known. The other man was handsome, with dark, intense eyes and a smile that looked both charming and dangerous. He looked familiar. Marco found this while looking into your family's records, Luca said, his voice quiet, all the hard edges gone. He pointed a finger at the second man. Tell me, Isabella, do you recognize the man standing next to your father? She stared at the photograph, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The intense eyes, the shape of the jaw. It was impossible. She looked from the photograph up to Luca's face, then back again. It was a younger version, but there was no mistaking it. The man in the picture, his arm thrown around her father's shoulder like a brother, was a young Luca Moretti. Isabella's world tilted, the luxurious suite seeming to sway as if hit by an earthquake. She stared at the photograph, her mind refusing to connect the images she was seeing. Her father, so young, so vibrant, so full of a life she never got to witness. And beside him, a man who was the spitting image of a younger Luca Moretti. The same intense eyes, the same dark hair, the same confident set of his jaw. The man who was her captor. The man who was the living embodiment of the world that had swallowed her father whole. Is that you? The question was a choked whisper, a denial and an accusation all in one. It was impossible. The timelines didn't match. Luca was her contemporary, not her father's. A strange look crossed Luca's face, something akin to sadness. No, he said, his voice quiet. That was my father, Giovanni Moretti. The name struck her like a physical blow. Giovanni Moretti, the legendary don of the Moretti family, the man whose very name was a curse in her house, a synonym for the danger her family had been running from for 2 decades. And there he was, his arm thrown around her father's shoulder as if they were brothers. No, she said, shaking her head, the denial instinctive, violent. You're lying. This is a trick, some kind of sick game. She pushed the photograph away as if it were burning her fingers. My father, he hated your family. He was trying to get away from you, from all of this. Your family. You're the reason he's dead. The words tumbled out, the core belief of her entire existence, the foundation upon which she had built her quiet, fearful life. Luca didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He simply watched her, his expression filled with a deep, unnerving pity that was worse than any rage. Is that what you were told? He asked softly. Is that the story your nonna told you to keep you safe? It's the truth, she cried, her voice cracking. No, Isabella, he said, his voice firm, cutting through her hysteria. It's the lie that killed him. He leaned forward, his dark eyes holding hers, demanding that she listen. Your father, Paolo Rossi, was a man of honor, a man who, like my father, saw the world they had inherited being poisoned. Men like Silvio Ricci's father were taking over, turning everything into a business of greed and betrayal with no respect for the old codes. Your father wasn't just trying to get out, Isabella. He was trying to fight back. The room was silent as his words sank in. Isabella felt a tremor of uncertainty, a crack in the bedrock of her lifelong fear. He came to my father, Luca continued, his voice resonating with the weight of history. In secret, not as an enemy, but as an equal, as an ally. They were planning to join forces, the Rossi family and the Moretti family. Together they were going to purge the rot from our world, They were going to create something better, something worthy of the names they carried. They were building a future. Isabella could only stare, her mind reeling, trying to reconcile the monster of her childhood nightmares with the noble ally Luca was describing. I don't believe you. The night your father died, Luca said, his voice dropping, each word a chisel chipping away at her reality. He wasn't running from us. He was driving to a secret meeting with my father to finalize the pact. But someone betrayed him. Someone from his own inner circle leaked the location of the meeting to the Ricci's. He paused, letting the full horror of the statement land. Ricci's father staged the accident, a cut brake line on a mountain road. A tragedy that looked like a Moretti hit to anyone who might have heard whispers of their meetings. It was perfect. The alliance died before it was ever born. Paolo Rossi was dead. And in the chaos that followed, the Ricci family stepped into the void, gaining power they never deserved. Your father wasn't killed by his enemies, Isabella. He was killed by the man he thought was his friend. And my father lost the one true ally he ever had. The truth hit her not like a wave, but like a vacuum, sucking all the air from her lungs, all the strength from her limbs. A lie. Her whole life had been built on a lie. The Morettis were not the monsters. They were the hope that had been extinguished. The man she was taught to fear was the son of the man her father had trusted with his life. The enemy wasn't the shadowy, powerful Moretti family. It was the brutish, pathetic Silvio Ricci, the man who had tried to grab her arm just hours ago. He was the son of her father's murderer. A strangled sob escaped her lips. The control she had maintained for years, for decades, shattered into a million pieces. The room blurred. The city lights became a meaningless smear. The weight of 20 years of misplaced fear, of a life spent hiding from the wrong shadows, came crashing down on her. She covered her face with her hands and wept, the raw, agonizing sounds of a world breaking apart.
He watched the truth destroy her, and he felt no triumph. Only a profound shared sorrow that echoed across 20 years of deception. He had expected denial, anger, accusations. He had not expected to see her soul so completely undone. The sound of her sobs was the sound of a heartbreaking, and it resonated with the ghost of his own father's grief, a grief Luca had never fully understood until this moment. His father had become a harder, colder man after Paolo Rossi's death. The light of that potential alliance had gone out of him, leaving only the grim duty of ruling a world he no longer believed in. He saw her then, not as a puzzle, not as a key to the past, not as a possession to be guarded. He saw a woman whose entire identity had been stolen from her, just as his father's dream had been stolen from him. They were connected, not by his power over her, but by a shared wound, a generational scar left by the same betrayal. He moved from the sofa and knelt in front of her chair, the act of supplication feeling more natural than any act of command he had ever made. He gently took her hands, pulling them away from her tear-streaked face. Her eyes were wide with a devastating, raw vulnerability he knew no one else had ever been allowed to see. "I know," he said, his voice a low murmur. "My father never recovered." He spoke of Paolo Rossi as a brother, the last man of honor. He shared this piece of himself, this fragment of his own history, because he needed her to understand that her pain was now his pain. "This is not just your fight, Isabella. The Ricci's didn't just take your father, they took the future from both our families." She looked at him, her tears still falling, but her gaze was searching, desperate. She was adrift in a sea of lies, and he was the only solid thing she could hold on to. He could see the storm of emotions in her eyes, grief, rage, confusion, and something else. A fragile, nascent trust. The captor had become the confessor, the jailer, the anchor. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, giving her every chance to pull away. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. Her skin was like silk. He felt the tremor that went through her, a current of electricity that arced between them, charged with 2 decades of grief and a few hours of intense, terrifying connection. The world narrowed to the space between their faces. The city, the suite, the ghosts of their fathers. It all faded away, leaving only the two of them, linked by a tragedy that had defined them both. He saw the question in her eyes, the same one that was burning in his gut. What now? What did they become, now that the lie was dead? He leaned in, and this time, when she didn't pull back, he closed the distance. His lips met hers, and it was not a kiss of seduction or of power. It was a kiss of shared desperation, of raw, aching need. It was the taste of salt from her tears, and the sharp bite of his whiskey. It was rage and grief and a sudden explosive passion that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment she spoke her family's dialect. She responded with a fierce, shattering urgency, her hands coming up to grip his shirt as if he were the only thing keeping her from flying apart. This was not a surrender. It was a fusion. 2 broken halves of a single, tragic story, finally coming together. In that kiss, a new alliance was forged, not of strategy or power, but of shared pain and a burning, desperate need for justice. The stakes were no longer about her freedom or his curiosity. They were about blood. And the past was no longer the past. It was a debt that was about to be collected.
The kiss ended, but the connection remained, a vibrant, humming current in the space between them. Isabella slowly opened her eyes, her hand still gripping the front of Luca's shirt. She was breathless, not from passion alone, but from the seismic shift that had just occurred. The world was new. The lines were redrawn. The man kneeling before her was no longer her captor. He was the son of her father's chosen ally, a partner in a story she was only just beginning to understand. For the first time in her adult life, she was not alone in her secret history. A fragile, unfamiliar feeling bloomed in her chest. Hope. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. The grief for her father was still a raw wound, but now it was twinned with a burning sense of purpose. Justice. The word felt real, tangible, something she could fight for. "Ricci," she said, her voice low and steady, the tears gone, replaced by a cold fire. "He won't know that we know the truth. We have the advantage. We can use it." Her mind, the sharp analytical tool she had used for sterile translations, was already working, seeing pathways and strategies. My Nonna, she might know more about the betrayal, about who my father trusted. Luca looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes was staggering. It was a look of awe, of possession, of a man seeing a future he hadn't dared to imagine. He stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. He didn't let her go. "You are incredible," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her skin. "But you are also in more danger than you can possibly comprehend." The hope in her chest flickered as the reality of their situation crashed back in. "The first thing we do is secure you, and your grandmother. No one gets near either of you." He was already moving, his focus shifting from the passion of the moment to the cold, hard lines of strategy. He released her and turned to his desk, picking up a phone and pressing a single button. "Marco, my office. Now." The shift was jarring. One moment, they were 2 souls connected by a shared wound. The next, he was the Dawn, and she was the asset to be protected. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She watched as he paced, his energy transforming the room, charging it with a sense of impending war. She had found a partner, but she feared she was about to be sidelined from the fight that was rightfully hers. She just didn't realize how quickly it would happen. The call came 10 minutes later. Luca was in his office with Marco, the door slightly ajar. Isabella was standing by the window staring down at the city when she heard Marco's phone buzz. She heard his quiet, professional greeting, and then a dead silence. She saw Marco's posture stiffen. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" Luca's voice was a blade. "The team at the Navigli apartment. Marco said, his own voice strained, stripped of its usual calm. They're dark. 2 men, ambushed, and… He paused. The grandmother, she's gone. The floor fell away from beneath Isabella's feet. The hope, the fire, the sense of purpose, it all turned to ash in her mouth. Gone. Her nonna was gone. That frail, stubborn, loving woman who was the only true home she had ever known. A wave of nausea and guilt so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. This was her fault. Her phone call. Her face. Her name. She had led the wolves to her grandmother's door. A guttural sound of pure anguish tore from her throat, and she stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth. Luca was out of the office in a second, his face a mask of stone-cold fury and something else. Something that looked like self-loathing. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the death of their fragile new alliance. "It's Ricci," Luca snarled, his voice a low growl. He didn't wait. The rat moved faster than I thought. "We have to get her back," Isabella pleaded, her voice breaking. "Luca, please." "I will get her back," he said, his voice absolute, leaving no room for argument. He turned to Marco. "Take her to the master bedroom. Lock it down. 2 guards on the door at all times. Nothing gets in or out without my direct order." Isabella stared at him in disbelief. The blood drained from her face. "What? No, you can't. You said we were in this together. I can help." "You will stay here, and you will be safe," he commanded, his face hard, closed off. All the vulnerability, all the connection from moments before was gone. He was the Don again, and she was a liability. "I am not a package to be stored," she screamed, lunging toward him, desperation making her reckless. "I am a Rossi. He took my family. This is my fight." Marco stepped in her path, a gentle but immovable wall. "Isabella," Luca said, his voice dangerously soft, his eyes burning with a desperate, protective fire. "I failed to protect your grandmother. I will not fail you. I will not risk you. That is final." He turned his back on her, a gesture of dismissal so complete it felt like a physical blow. Marco gently but firmly guided her toward the bedroom. She fought him, tears of rage and terror streaming down her face. "Luca, don't do this. Don't shut me out." He never turned around. The heavy bedroom door closed, and she heard the sickening final sound of a magnetic lock engaging. She was a prisoner again. But this time, it was worse. Before, he was her captor. Now he was her partner, her ally, the man she had just trusted with the broken pieces of her soul. And he had betrayed that trust completely, locking her away in the dark while her grandmother was in the hands of a monster.
Murderous rage was a cold, clean fire in Luca's veins. He listened to Isabella scream his name from behind the locked door, and every cry was a nail driven into his soul. He wanted to go to her, to hold her, to explain. But what could he explain? That he had been so lost in the revelation of their shared past, so consumed by the kiss that had sealed their new reality, that he had let his guard down for a fatal few moments. That his hesitation, his brief indulgence in emotion, had cost her grandmother her freedom, and possibly her life. There were no words for that kind of failure. There was only action. "Find him," Luca ordered Marco, his voice a low growl that vibrated with barely suppressed violence. "Tear this city apart. I want every informant, every camera, every contact we have. I want to know where Silvio Ricci is breathing. I want him found. An hour ago." Marco nodded, his face grim. "He won't be in any of his usual places. He's gone to ground. This was a well-planned professional hit on my men. He's not just a drunk thug anymore, Luca. He's cornered." "A cornered rat is still a rat," Luca snarled, sweeping a crystal glass from his desk. It shattered against the far wall, the sound doing nothing to quell the storm inside him. He was losing control, and he knew it. The icy calm that had served him his entire life was gone, replaced by a furious, desperate fear for Isabella's safety. He had seen the hope in her eyes, and he had let it be extinguished by his own arrogance. He had locked her away, not just for her safety, but for his. He couldn't think, couldn't focus with the raw, terrifying possibility of losing her clouding his judgment. Her heartbroken cries from behind that door were the price of his focus. He had to believe it was worth it. For hours, they worked. The penthouse became a war room. Information flowed in, but it was all useless. Ricci had vanished. His known properties were empty. His top men were unreachable. It was as if he and his entire operation had been swallowed by the earth. Luca paced the length of his office like a caged panther, the city lights below mocking his powerlessness. He was the king of Milan, and he couldn't find one man in his own kingdom. The situation was slipping through his fingers, the helplessness a poison in his blood. He was failing his father's memory, failing the promise he had seen in Isabella's eyes. He was going to lose her, just as both their fathers had lost everything. Then, at 3 a.m., a burner phone, one he hadn't used in years, vibrated on his desk. A number he didn't recognize. He knew instantly who it was. He gestured for Marco to start a trace and answered, his voice pure ice. Ricci. Silvio Ricci's voice came through the speaker, no longer slurring or uncertain, but filled with the smug, arrogant triumph of a man holding all the cards. Don Moretti, so glad you could take my call. I have something of yours, or rather, something of your little pet Rossi's. He laughed, a foul, ugly sound. The old woman is surprisingly tough. Reminds me of her daughter-in-law. A real firecracker, that one's mother was. Luca's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles were white. The casual mention of Isabella's mother was a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. What do you want, Silvio? Luca ground out. What I've always wanted. Respect. And a bit of payback, Ricci said, his voice dripping with venom. Our fathers had their disagreements. It seems we are destined to finish them. I want the girl, the Rossi girl. You bring her to me, unharmed, and I will let the old woman go. Luca felt the blood drain from his face. It was an impossible choice. A checkmate. Where? Luca asked, his mind racing, searching for an angle, a weakness, anything. The old Valentini warehouse by the canal. You know the one. You have until sunrise, Ricci said. Come alone. Just you and the girl. Any tricks, any sign of your men, and the old woman dies. And then I promise you, what I do to the girl will make you wish you had never heard the name Rossi. The line went dead. Marco looked at him, his face pale. The trace was blocked. He's using a ghost signal. It's untraceable. Luca stared at the silent phone in his hand. Sunrise was in less than 3 hours. He had no location for the grandmother. No way to mount a rescue, only an ultimatum. Hand over Isabella to a monster to be tortured and killed, or condemn her grandmother to the same fate. He looked toward the locked bedroom door. Behind it was the woman he had promised to protect, the woman who had trusted him. He had failed her at every turn, and now he was trapped. The darkest hour had fallen, and for the first time in his life, Luca Moretti saw no way out.
The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on Isabella's chest, making it hard to breathe. For an hour, she had sat on the floor of the lavish bedroom, a prisoner in a silk-lined box, drowning in the silence and her own crushing guilt. Her nonna was gone. Luca had locked her away. The hope she had felt so briefly was a cruel joke. She was a pawn, just as she had always feared, a piece to be moved and sacrificed in a game played by powerful men. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth, the terror a cold, coiling serpent in her gut. Then, something inside her shifted. It was a flicker of anger, hot and clean, that burned through the fog of her despair. She thought of her father, a man who died trying to fight these very shadows. She thought of her nonna, who had survived for 20 years on pure, stubborn resilience. They were Rossi's, and Rossi's did not break. They did not wait for rescue. They fought. She stood up, her movements stiff at first, then more certain. The animal panic receded, replaced by a sharp, cold focus. Crying wouldn't save her Nonna. Waiting for Luca wouldn't save her Nonna. She had to think. She closed her eyes, forcing herself out of the penthouse, out of Milan, and into the landscape of her memory, into the stories her Nonna used to tell. Ricci. Where would a man like Ricci go? He was arrogant, sentimental in a brutish way. He wouldn't use a common warehouse unless it was a trick. He would choose a place that was both secure and symbolic. A place that would amplify his victory over the Rossis and the Morettis. He thought he was finishing a story his father started. He would want the final chapter to have meaning. Her mind sifted through fragments of conversations, stories told over steaming bowls of pasta, warnings whispered in the old dialect. A story about a branch of the Rossi family from generations ago, a branch that had betrayed a trust and been cast out, their names stricken from the records. Their lands had been left to rot, a testament to their shame. And on that land, a memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the gloom. Her Nonna, telling a scary story to a young Isabella, her voice low and dramatic. And on that cursed land there is a chapel, left to crumble. The angels on its walls weep for the sins of the forgotten ones. A forgotten chapel, deconsecrated, isolated, completely off the grid, a place that represented a stain on the Rossi name. It would be the perfect theater for Ricci's twisted sense of justice, to hold the last true Rossi matriarch captive in a place built on Rossi shame. And then, the final, crucial detail clicked into place. A line from the story her Nonna had repeated for emphasis. You can always find the path to it, even when the weeds are high if you look for the weeping angel at the gate. A statue. That was it. That was the key. She had it. A piece of information that Luca's network of spies and satellites could never find. It was a secret buried in a children's ghost story. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her, but she was still locked in. The guards outside were Luca's men, loyal only to him. They wouldn't listen to a hysterical prisoner. She needed Marco, or Luca himself. She scanned the room, her mind racing. She couldn't fake an illness. They'd send a doctor, not the Don. She needed to create a problem only Luca could solve. Her eyes landed on the priceless modern art painting hanging on the wall. With a deep breath, she walked over to the small marble-top table, picked up the heaviest lamp she could lift, and hurled it with all her strength into the center of the canvas. The sound of tearing fabric and shattering plaster was a thunderclap. The guards burst in seconds later, weapons drawn, finding her standing amidst the destruction, breathing heavily, her eyes blazing with purpose. "Get Marco!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Tell him the prisoner has vital intelligence, and then get Luca. Tell him I know where Ricci is. Tell him to ask me about the weeping angel."
Sunrise was a threat on the horizon. Luca stood in his office, the city below still cloaked in darkness, and felt the walls closing in. He was out of time and out of options. Every lead was a dead end. Every informant was silent. Ricci had orchestrated a perfect vanishing act, and the ultimatum hung over Luca's head like a guillotine. Give Ricci the woman he was beginning to realize he couldn't live without, or sign the death warrant for her innocent grandmother. It was a choice designed to destroy him no matter what he did. He was staring at the abyss of a failure so profound it would dishonor his father's memory and shatter his own soul. He was so lost in his own personal hell that he barely registered Marco entering the office until he spoke. "Luca," Marco said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's been an incident." Luca's blood ran cold. "Is she hurt?" "No. She's redecorating," Marco said, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "She destroyed the painting in the bedroom. She's demanding to see you. She says she knows where Ricci is." Luca's first reaction was a wave of dismissive anger, a trick, a desperate plea for attention. How could she possibly know something his entire organization, the most powerful in northern Italy, had failed to uncover. "She's panicking, Marco. Keep her contained." "I don't think so," Marco said, holding Luca's gaze. "She was calm, very calm. She gave me a message for you. She said to ask her about the weeping angel." The words hung in the air. Weeping angel. It wasn't data. It wasn't surveillance. It was folklore. It was a phrase from the old world, the world of history and blood feuds that he had been trying to fight with modern warfare. A jolt went through him, a sudden, blinding flash of insight. He had been a fool. He had been using maps when he needed to be using legends. He had locked away his single greatest asset because he was afraid of losing her, when she was, in fact, the only key to winning. Her history, her memories, the stories she carried in her blood. That was the weapon he needed. His strategy wasn't just wrong. It had been arrogant. He looked at Marco, a new, desperate light in his eyes. "Open the door." He strode to the bedroom and unlocked the door himself. She was standing in the middle of the room, amidst the wreckage of the lamp and painting. Her chin high, her arms crossed. The fear and despair were gone from her eyes, replaced by a fierce, brilliant fire. She was not a victim. She was not a prisoner. She was the queen of a lost dynasty, and she was magnificent. He stopped in the doorway, the apology and the command dying on his lips. He didn't see a liability he needed to protect. He saw his partner, his equal, the true heir to the Rossi spirit his father had so admired. "Tell me," he said, his voice raw with a hope he hadn't felt in hours. "Tell me everything." She didn't hesitate. She laid it all out. The story of the disgraced family branch, the forgotten and isolated chapel, the symbolic significance it would hold for a man like Ricci, and the weeping angel, the landmark that would lead them there when all other maps were blank. It made a horrifying, perfect sense. It was a move born of old-world grudges, a place no modern intelligence could ever predict. The crushing weight of hopelessness lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a surging electric adrenaline. He turned to Marco. "Get me every map and satellite image you can find of the rural areas west of the city. Look for structures that could be old chapels. Cross-reference it with old property records, anything tied to the Rossi name, no matter how old." He turned back to Isabella, grabbing her hand, his touch no longer possessive but grounding. He pulled her into his office, to the large table where his failed plans were laid out. "We're not trading for her, Isabella. We're getting her back." He spread a new map across the table. For the next hour they worked together, a seamless team forged in the crucible of crisis. His tactical mind, her deep knowledge of her family's history. Hope was a tangible thing in the room now, a weapon they were sharpening together. He trusted her. Completely. He listened as she recalled details about the likely layout, based on the stories. She was not just the key. She was the architect of their victory. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Marco found it. A grainy satellite image of a crumbling structure in a thicket of woods, almost completely overgrown, and on the screen, just visible at the start of a faded track leading towards it, was a small, weathered stone statue, its head bowed in grief. The weeping angel. Luca looked at Isabella, his eyes blazing with a fierce, renewed determination. The sun was rising, but it was no longer Ricci's deadline. It was theirs. "Let's go get your grandmother," he said. The drive was silent, slicing through the pale, pre-dawn light that washed the Italian countryside in shades of gray and lavender. Luca sat in the front passenger seat of the lead SUV, a custom-built machine that was more armor than automobile. In the back, flanked by two of his most trusted men, sat Isabella. He glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. The terror he had expected to see in her eyes wasn't there. It had been replaced by a resolve so cold and hard it mirrored his own. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her posture was perfect. She was not the frightened interpreter from the hotel anymore. She was a Rossi, going to war for the matriarch of her family. A surge of fierce, protective pride washed over him. They stopped a kilometer from the location, the vehicles concealed in a thicket of ancient cypress trees. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. Luca gathered his team, a hand-picked group of 5 men, including Marco. They were the best, silent, efficient, and completely loyal. "The objective is the woman," Luca said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "We get her out, safe. Ricci is secondary. His men are obstacles. Eliminate them with prejudice. No collateral damage. We go in silent. We leave clean." He spread a schematic of the chapel, drawn from Isabella's descriptions and architectural records, on the hood of the SUV. Isabella's knowledge gives us an advantage. She believes there is a small sacristy door on the east wall, likely unsecured. That is our entry point. He turned to her, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "This will be ugly. There is still time for you to wait here." Isabella stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation. "My father died because he was betrayed. My grandmother is in there because of my name. My family's story does not end with me waiting in a car, Luca. I am the reason you know where to find them. I will see this through." He saw the unbreakable will in her eyes and knew arguing was pointless. More than that, he knew she was right. This was her battle as much as his. "All right," he nodded. "But you do exactly as I say. Your role is the most important, and the most dangerous." He explained the plan. His team would move into position, covering the east and west flanks. Isabella would be their signal, their diversion. He handed her a small earpiece. "When we are in place, I will give you the word. That's when you walk, and that's when you call to her." He looked her deep in the eyes. "Can you do this?" "I can," she said, her voice a whisper of steel. They moved through the overgrown woods like wraiths. The chapel emerged from the trees, a skeleton of gray stone against the slowly brightening sky. It was even more dilapidated than the satellite images suggested, a place drowning in neglect and sorrow. At the entrance to the overgrown path, a stone statue of an angel, its face streaked with moss like green tears, bowed its head in perpetual grief. The weeping angel. Isabella had led them true. Luca and his team melted into the shadows around the chapel. He watched through a small pair of binoculars as 2 of Ricci's guards patrolled lazily near the main doors. Amateurs. He got into position near the sacristy door, his men ready. He pressed the button on his comms unit. "Now, Isabella, now."
Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But she silenced them. She thought of her Nonna, of her father, of the 20 years she had spent living as a ghost. Not anymore. She took a deep breath and stepped out from the cover of the trees, onto the overgrown path leading to the chapel. The morning air was cold on her skin. The crunch of her footsteps on the gravel seemed impossibly loud. One of Ricci's guards saw her. He straightened up, his eyes widening in disbelief, and nudged his partner. They both stared, their guns half raised, too shocked to even shout a warning. She was the last person they expected to see, walking calmly toward them as if arriving for Sunday Mass. She ignored them. Her focus was entirely on the heavy wooden doors of the chapel. She pictured her grandmother inside, terrified, alone. Isabella filled her lungs and then, she let her voice rise into the quiet morning, not with a scream, but with a song. It was a lullaby from the old dialect, a song her Nonna used to sing to her when she was a child, a song of hope and home. "Nina nana, Nina o, questo bimbo a chilo do." Her voice, pure and clear, floated through the air, a sound so out of place in this scene of violence and decay that it was utterly mesmerizing. It was her only weapon, and she wielded it with all the love and courage in her soul. She saw the guards falter, confused. She heard a commotion from inside the chapel, an angry, questioning shout. "Ricci!" She had his attention. She kept walking, kept singing, her eyes fixed on the door, pouring all of her history, her grief, and her fierce, desperate love into the melody. The diversion worked. Just as an enraged Ricci threw open the main doors to see what was happening, she heard the muffled, efficient sounds of Luca's team breaching the sacristy. The guards at the front turned, distracted for a fatal second. It was all the time Luca's men on the flank needed. The world erupted into a flurry of motion. Ricci dragged her inside, his hand clamped around her arm like a vice, his face a mask of fury. "You little fool, you led him right to me!" But it was too late. Inside the chapel, 2 of his men were already down, dispatched with silent, brutal efficiency. She saw Luca, a blur of dark, controlled motion, moving through the dusty shafts of light from the broken stained glass windows. He was not a brawler. He was a predator, his every movement precise, economical, and lethal. He took down the last guard, then his eyes, black and deadly, locked onto Ricci. In the chaos, she saw Marco appear at a side door, half carrying, half guiding her nonna to safety. Her grandmother was pale and shaken, but she was alive. She was safe. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made Isabella weep washed over her. Ricci, realizing he was trapped, shoved Isabella forward, pulling a gun and pressing it to her temple. "That's far enough, Moretti, or the girl dies right here on this pathetic excuse for an altar." Luca stopped, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. "Let her go, Silvio. It's over." "It's not over!" Ricci screamed, his voice hysterical. He was losing, and he knew it. Spittle flew from his lips. He looked from Luca to Isabella, his eyes burning with a lifetime of resentment. "You think you know the story, you little ghost? You think you figured it all out?" He laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "Your father didn't just trust my father, he loved him like a brother. He confided everything in him. He cried on his shoulder about your mother's illness. My father was his confessor, his closest friend. And my father listened to every pathetic word. And then he went and cut his brake lines himself. The ultimate betrayal isn't killing an enemy, Moretti. It's killing a friend who looks you in the eyes and tells you he trusts you completely." The final piece of the story, the most venomous and cruel detail, slammed into Isabella. Her father hadn't just been betrayed. He had been destroyed by his most profound friendship. The evil was deeper, more personal, than she could ever have imagined. Luca took a step, preparing to end it, but Isabella held up a hand. "No, wait." She turned her head, slowly, until her eyes met Ricci's. The gun was still pressed to her temple, but she felt no fear, only a vast, cold calm. "My father was a man of honor, Silvio," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with power in the cavernous space. "He believed in things like trust and friendship. Your father was a parasite who fed on that goodness." She switched to the old dialect, her voice taking on the weight and rhythm of an ancient curse. "Voi non avete distrutto il nome Rossi, avete solo avvelenato il vostro." You did not destroy the Rossi name, you only poisoned your own. She looked him in the eye, and he saw not a terrified girl, but the full, unyielding weight of the legacy he had tried to extinguish. "My family's story is one of honor. Yours is one of shame, and it ends today." In that moment of defiance, Ricci faltered. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Luca needed. He moved with impossible speed. There was a blur of motion, a sharp crack of bone as Luca disarmed him. And then Ricci was on his knees, gasping, Luca's hand clamped around his throat. Luca looked at Isabella, his eyes asking a silent question. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Justice. His action was swift, decisive, and final. He was not a murderer. He was an executioner. The sound of Silvio Ricci's last breath was a quiet, final punctuation mark on a story of betrayal that had lasted for 20 years. It was over. The threat was gone. Luca released the body and walked to Isabella, his eyes searching hers. In the dusty, quiet chapel, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared past, he gently reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The battle was won. Justice at last had been served. The echoes of the final terrible moments in the chapel faded, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The dust motes danced in the slanted morning light, illuminating a scene of finished violence. Silvio Ricci lay still, a pathetic, crumpled footnote in a story that was never truly his. It was over. 20 years of running, of hiding, of living as a ghost. It had all ended here, in this forgotten place of shame that they had reclaimed with their own justice. Luca stood before her, his face grim but the storm in his eyes finally calm. He was no longer a captor, no longer a commander. He was just a man, standing with her at the end of a long and bloody road. But Isabella's eyes were drawn past him to the side door where Marco was helping her nonna to her feet. She moved, her legs feeling strangely light. She walked past the wreckage of their past and straight into her grandmother's arms. The embrace was fierce, desperate, a collision of past, present, and a future she hadn't dared to believe in an hour ago. Her nonna was frail, her small body trembling, but her arms were strong, holding Isabella with the same unshakable love that had been the only constant in her life. "Sei al sicuro, nonna," Isabella whispered into her grandmother's silver hair, the words in their old, shared dialect. "You are safe." "No, tesoro mio," her grandmother whispered back, pulling away to look at her, her ancient, wise eyes wet with tears. "Noi siamo al sicuro." "We are safe." She looked from Isabella's face to Luca, who stood watching them with a quiet, respectful distance. A long, silent conversation passed between the old woman and the powerful young Don. Isabella saw a flicker of the past in her grandmother's eyes, a memory of old alliances, of trust and betrayal. And then she saw acceptance. A slow, tired, but certain nod. It was a blessing. The last ghost of the old feud was finally laid to rest. The journey back was nothing like the tense, silent rides that had come before. This time, Isabella sat in the back with her nonna, holding her hand, the two of them speaking in low, soft tones, rebuilding their world with words. She felt Luca's eyes on her in the rearview mirror, not with the intense, analytical stare of before, but with a warm, protective gaze that felt like coming home. The city of Milan, which had once seemed like a glittering prison, now looked like a kingdom she was returning to, not as a servant, but as a queen. But Luca didn't take them back to the penthouse. The sleek black cars bypassed the city center, heading north toward the mountains and the deep, tranquil blue of Lake Como. An hour later, they pulled through a set of old, wrought-iron gates and up a gravel driveway lined with cypress trees, stopping before a magnificent, sun-drenched villa. It wasn't a modern palace of glass and steel like the hotel. It was a place of old stone, terracotta tiles, and sprawling bougainvillea, its windows open to the sparkling water. It smelled of jasmine and history. "My grandfather built this place," Luca said, coming around to open her door. "It was our family's sanctuary, before everything." He was offering her more than just a place to stay. He was offering her a home, a new beginning, far from the shadows of Milan. Here, with her nonna safe and the ghosts of the past finally at peace, Isabella felt the last of the tension she had carried in her shoulders for 2 decades finally melt away. She stepped out of the car and, for the first time in her life, she breathed free.
Luca watched Isabella and her grandmother on the terrace of the villa, a sight so profoundly right that it settled a part of his soul he hadn't even known was restless. For his entire life, this villa had been a place of ghosts, of a father who grew colder with each passing year, of a legacy that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Now, seeing Isabella's genuine, radiant smile as she listened to her nonna, he felt the ghosts retreat. They were bringing life back to this place. They were bringing life back to him. He had spent his life surrounded by soldiers, sycophants, and enemies. He had never understood the quiet, unshakable strength of family until he saw these two women together. He had set out to solve a mystery, to claim a piece of the past. He had never expected to find his future. Marco approached him, His face relaxed for the first time in days. "It's done," he said quietly. "With Silvio gone, his entire organization is collapsing. The rats are turning on each other. By the end of the week, the Ricci name will be nothing but a bad memory." "Good," Luca said, his eyes never leaving Isabella. "Ensure it is thorough." "Of course," Marco replied. He paused. "She is good for you, Luca." Luca looked at his oldest friend, the man who had been his shadow for as long as he could remember, and gave a small, genuine smile. "I know." Later that evening, after her nonna had retired to bed, Luca found Isabella walking by the edge of the lake. The water was like dark glass, reflecting the first stars in the twilight sky. She had changed out of her simple black dress and into a soft, borrowed sweater that belonged to his mother from long ago. She looked like she belonged here. "I used to think my life was a closed circle," he said, his voice quiet as he came to stand beside her. "An endless loop of duty, violence, and loneliness. Then you walked into that room in Milan." She turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I spent my whole life running from your name, Luca. I thought you were the monster at the end of the story." "And now?" he asked, his heart in his throat. "Now I know the monster was just a man," she said softly. "A man who was just as trapped by the past as I was." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "You gave me back my name. You gave me justice. You gave me a reason for it all to matter," he countered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "The Moretti legacy. It's all power and strategy. It has no heart. I think," he said, turning to face her fully, "it's always been missing a Rossi." He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles. "Stay with me, Isabella, not as a guest, not as someone I protect, as my partner, my equal. Help me build the world our fathers dreamed of." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. "I will," she whispered, "but not as a woman hiding in a villa, as a partner, your advisor, your conscience when you need one." He laughed, a real free sound that echoed over the water. "I have a feeling I will need one often." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, because she was. "I love you, Isabella Rossi, not for your name or your history. I love you for the woman who threw a lamp at a priceless painting because she refused to be a victim." She laughed through her tears, her arms circling his neck. "And I love you, Luca Moretti, the man who saw a ghost and wasn't afraid." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, grief-stricken kiss from the penthouse. This was a kiss of profound peace, of absolute certainty. It was a kiss of promise of forever, a seal on a future that was finally theirs to write. A few months later, the afternoon sun warmed the stone of the terrace. The scent of lemon groves and fresh coffee hung in the air. Elena Rossi sat in a comfortable chair, telling an animated story to a smiling Marco, who seemed to have adopted her as his own grandmother. Isabella leaned against the balustrade, watching them, a gentle smile on her face. She felt a familiar, warm presence come up behind her, and then Luca's strong arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Happy?" he murmured into her ear. She leaned back against his chest, her heart full to bursting. She looked out over the sparkling blue water of the lake, a view that was now as familiar and comforting as her own reflection. Her father had wanted her to be a nobody to be safe. He had wanted her to be invisible. But here, in the arms of the most powerful man she had ever known, she was more visible, more herself, than ever before. "My father was wrong about one thing," she said softly. "He thought I had to lose my name to find peace." She turned in his arms to face him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "But I had to reclaim it to find my life." He smiled, a slow, deep smile that was just for her, and kissed her. A long, sweet kiss full of unspoken promises and the quiet joy of a new beginning. She was Isabella Rossi Moretti, and for the first time, she was not only safe, she was home.